Well, welcome back. This is Dr. Dean Blevins, and this is a presentation that's part of CED 630, Ministry with Children, where we're going to be discussing the role of the children's pastor, particularly within evangelical congregations and within the Church Nazarene, both in larger churches, but also nowadays in intermediate and sometimes smaller churches. And understanding the rise of the children's pastor, where we've come from, and where we're going to suggest some of where the future is going to take us as well. Now, to begin, what I'd like to start is from a historical perspective and a journey back a little over 100 years ago to the kind of rise of a field called Christian education, or CE, and the various waves of influence that has brought us to this period of time where we now have not only just an emphasis on Christian education at large, but also specifically on the role of children's and children's ministry and children's pastors. And where did that come from? Well, you really have to go back to the late 19th, early 20th century to begin to get a shift toward a pastoral role, if you will, a place for children's ministers within evangelical churches. Prior to this period, we've always had what I would call assistants in ministry with clergy. Sometimes people who've worked in non-traditional forms of ministry, in compassionate care, such as deaconesses and the founding of hospitals, or assistance in the process of worship and liturgy, even official roles within certain denominations and traditions like Catholicism that are highly organized and highly specialized. But when it comes to the oversight, particularly the oversight of the formation of children and youth and even adults, prior to the beginning of the 20th century, understanding this as a particular specialization within the life of the church was rarely thought of. I mean, if you think of prior to that period, education occurred either through the direct act of the bishop, as in the case of Augustine of Hippo in the early church, and many other bishops and pastors in the catechesis and the preparation of lay people for baptism, and later through preaching, or it might occur through the general educational efforts of learned ministers like the Puritan era and Jonathan Edwards and other places, where a pastor might also be a school teacher and maybe the greatest intellectual within a given village at that point in time. But even later than that, with the advent of the Sunday school movement, particularly in the United States and Canada, which was conceived primarily as more of a missional outreach movement that provided basic literacy in reading, writing, and grammar, right alongside basic biblical and religious literacy, and was seen primarily as a lay supported and lay endorsed movement that occurred first outside the life of the church and then was gradually incorporated into the life of the church. And if you were to say education of children, either the public school setting or the of the village school, or the catechetical preparation of the bishop and the minister preparing for baptism, or in this kind of broad-based strategy of reaching children through Sunday school, would have been the ways people tended to think about it until the turn of the 20th century. And then we began to see the advent of a particular group of specialists in the field of religious education. This was occurring at a time when two things were happening concurrently. One is that the Sunday school movement was reaching its major sort of peak and exposing both its strengths and its limits of attempting to teach Bible to every age level, but pretty much from a uniform perspective. And also the advent of the development of certain social sciences such as psychology, as well as sociology, and also an emphasis upon renewed study of Scripture based on higher criticism that was occurring, where we were getting a much deeper, broader, sometimes challenging view of Scripture than ever before. And at the University of Chicago, a group of biblical scholars came together who said that we needed to have a much more nuanced approach to teaching Scripture based on student readiness, including where they are psychologically and sociologically, as well as a deeper understanding of the scriptures themselves and a stronger theological background. And those scholars came together and started a new association that they deemed as the Religious Education Association. And so you had the advent at the beginning of the 20th century of an academic field through the REA, but also a major grassroots movement, similar to some that we see even today, where people banded together to begin to specialize in the teaching of Scripture based on good psychological, good educational, and good biblical preparation. And the REA was as much a grassroots movement of educators within congregations as it was an academic field. But you saw the rise of a unique group called directors of religious education, particularly in larger churches, primarily in urban settings where people had flocked back to cities because of the rise of industrialization. And these churches could afford to hire these directors who would oversee the educational efforts of training children, youth, and adults in their local congregations. It's important to stress that these were normally directors. These were not pastors. These were lay associates within the lives of the church. But it was a kind of emerging field that entered into the consciousness of congregations of needing specialists in this area. That was a short-lived field, at least at the beginning, because of the Great Depression. And as a result of that, as we think of specialists working in congregations, there was a radical drop-off during the Great Depression. But at least in those first 2 decades of the 20th century, prior to the Depression itself, we began to see the rise of specializations around the field of education, if you will, that were then sort of renewed after the Great Depression, particularly as a denominational, not so much a grassroots, but a denominational focus within mainline churches. And when I say mainline, I mean primarily congregations that are Episcopalian or Lutheran or Presbyterian or United Methodist, so the large major denominations that populated the United States at this time. Just parenthetically, Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, has retained in many places the term religious education even today, though certain mainline denominations had already begun to shift nomenclature to Christian education even as early as the 1940s. But this renewal was so important that it finally created the ICRE, or International Council on Religious Education, which marked the first time that the need for a sustained both grassroots and academic approach to educating congregations for the sake of a global emphasis. And the ICRE might have been sort of the culmination of this mainline emphasis that really began to maintain a kind of global focus as well as a United States and Canada focus. Excuse me. Now, up until this point, we've been mainly talking about mainline denominations, but in the 1950s, we also saw the advent of the evangelical or neo-evangelical movement. This started through the National Association of Evangelicals as this new evangelistic effort spawned in part through national evangelistic crusades like the Billy Graham Crusades and others like that, began to create a whole new cohort of churches, somewhat more conservative, sometimes independent of the mainline denominations, sometimes of smaller denominations, and I would include in here probably the Church of the Nazarene, that began to grow and thrive as a result of sort of the post-World War II enthusiasm here in the United States. And alongside the rise of evangelical emphases and evangelism, also the rise of a new group of Christian educators tasked with somewhat the same role as the religious educators of the early part of the century in the creation of the North American Professors of Christian Education. This group, now known as Society of Professors of Christian Education, really are the evangelical version of the REA. And they were also tasked with providing both an academic and educational training and background in creating new directors of Christian education, again focused primarily on the larger emphases of educating the whole congregation, regardless of children, youth, and adult, to augment the work that was going on, particularly of denominational Sunday schools at this point in time. And also drawing upon independent curriculum producers that were beginning to emerge, like David C. Cook, Standard Press, others that were coming along and resourcing Christian education either through Sunday school literature or actually through independent programming alongside that. By the 1970s, these evangelical churches, which I want to now call mainstream churches, since evangelicalism began to displace the mainline congregations as the primary churches as we understand, both as an economic force as well as a religious force within the United States and Canada, these mainstream churches began also to put particular emphasis on youth and then children through program ministry. Now, to begin with, we're still talking primarily directors of youth as well as directors of children, but suddenly the sub-specialization of specific programming for youth and specific programming for children began to emerge on the scene and to really take shape by the 1970s. Bear in mind, at least in youth, this had begun as early as the 1950s, particularly as people came back from World War II, young men who felt a call to ministry, but often churches didn't have places for them as senior pastors, so they placed them with oversight within youth ministry, as well as the rise of parachurch youth movements like the National Youth Workers Movement, Youth for Christ, and Young Life, which created a kind of parallel grassroots subspecialization of youth workers, professional youth workers that were occurring in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that began to really spill into denominations, evangelical denominations, in the creation of that same kind of subspecialization. It's beyond the scope of this class, but even the move from the National Young People's Society and the Church Nazarene to MYI, Nazarene Youth International, really was a kind of shift to this kind of programmed emphasis as well. And something similar was happening in children's ministry at the same time. And so suddenly it was no longer merely Christian education that was the primary focus across all age levels, but now we had specific emphases and programming and ministry with youth and also with children, albeit still primarily at the director's level or youth worker or children's workers level, but we'll talk more about the advent of pastoral language as we move forward. Specifically within the Church of Nazarene, you had a similar emphasis as a result of the rise of the Nazarene Multiple Staff Association. And associate ministry became an important role in the Church of the Nazarene between the 1970s and 1980s as a actual employable field where people might consider being a full-time children's worker, a full-time children's minister, or a full-time youth minister in a Nazarene church. And suddenly the denomination had to come to terms with this rise of associate staff, which also included, by the way, ministers of worship or music leaders in congregations, business administrative personnel, as well as chaplaincy and a host of other types of roles that were seen as augmenting the role of the senior pastor. This finally culminated in the rise of a second ordination track in the Church of Nazarene known as the Order of Deacon. Just to note, the Order of Deacon in the Church of Nazarene actually occurred faster than it did even in some mainline denominations. For instance, United Methodist Church, the diaconal ministry was not an ordained order in the United Methodist Church until almost the turn of the 21st century, late 1990s, if memory serves me. And so in some ways, Church of Nazarene was already beginning to recognize and ordain staff members prior to United Methodist Church, but it was to a second order that did not include within it either the call to preach specifically, substituting a specialization in its place, nor necessarily the opportunity to actually pastor and oversee the entire congregation. The overall leadership was still retained primarily for the ordination as elder, and so this deacon ordination, albeit an adoption of an ordained pastoral ministry, was still identified as a specialized ordination and not seen as primary leadership and the key leadership for the denomination itself. Probably the final major influence, particularly for children's pastors, that occurred really happened late in the 20th century with the resurgence of the child, particularly within evangelicalism, mainline, not so much mainline churches, but mainstream churches, and also within the Church of the Nazarene. What we began to see is the rise of parallel organizations. For instance, we saw the rise of CPC, the Children's Pastors Conference, which was a parallel kind of independent grassroots conference that occurred right alongside the National Youth Workers Conventions and was seen as a kind of children's leadership preparation and continuing education conference, much like Youth Specialties National Youth Workers Convention is seen for that for youth ministry. And the CPC was really, much like the National Youth Workers Convention, were really extensions of an earlier movement of Sunday school conventions that had occurred at the beginning of the 20th century and had actually continued through the majority of the 20th century until about the 1970s, 1980s. As a matter of fact, as late as the 1980s, one could attend the Greater Los Angeles Sunday School Convention, known as GLASS, which was a very large convention that would occur, interesting enough, in Pasadena, that would include a host of curriculum producers and a host of workshops all around Sunday school ministries and discipleship and Christian education at large, but would include subsets of youth and children's preparation. Suddenly, now one had youth workers conventions and children's pastors conventions that displaced these bigger movements, and these were really forerunners of what we now know as the group conferences or other curriculum producers, such as David C. Cook does their own in family ministry, or even the Orange conventions. Each of those being sort of, if you will, even subspecializations within these areas. We also saw the rise of children's pastors as advisors within the Church of Nazarene. The creation of what was then the Nazarene Children's Pastors Association was primarily the bringing together children's pastors in the denomination to serve as advisors to the broader efforts in Sunday school and discipleship ministries, particularly for the sake of children at large within the denomination. And this group was a forerunner to the Nazarene Children's Leadership Network of today, but it was primarily an advisory group that served a strategic role in helping to guide children's ministry at large within the denomination, but still seen primarily as a really helpful and not a competitive role to the efforts of Sunday school ministries and discipleship in the Church of the Nazarene. Finally, in the Church of the Nazarene, we also saw the rise of a quadrennial emphasis known as the emphasis on children and youth late in the 20th century and moving into the 21st century. And some of you who are children's pastors might remember that emphasis. You'll still see vestiges of it in literature in a lot of places. And there was a famous video and curriculum created called You're Losing Me. That was really a concern about the generation that was coming into the church that we now know as the Millennial Generation, which includes both youth and now young adults in the life of the church. Now, why was this important? Because this might have been the last time we saw the largest cohort of children enter into what I would call North American culture, particularly United States culture, and the culture of the Church of the Nazarene. The earliest advent of these children actually were known as the baby boom generation that followed after 1945. And at that point, we had an outflow of young children that were born after World War II, particularly from the era of 1946 to about 1966, that marked the first wave, if you will, of children that sort of exploded on the scene of the church at large and created the first sort of emphases in youth and children's ministry program that we saw by the 1970s. Well, by the 1990s, we were actually seeing the children of those children, the baby boomers, as well as the children of the first generation of children of the baby boomers, the baby busters. Now that may sound confusing, but what happened was that baby boomers, often at age 20 or 21, would have kids, and that was known as the Gen X generation or the baby busters. But many of them actually also chose either to postpone childbearing, or actually, after they had established themselves in their careers, return and have a second generation of children. And so you had baby boomers having children as late as ages 39 to 42 or even up to 45, right alongside their first generation of children, the baby busters, having children. And so for the first time, in a rather remarkable way, two different age level cohorts, the baby boomers and the baby busters, were continuing to have children, creating what might now be the most massive cohort that was influencing the life of the church at the beginning of the 21st century, known as the millennials. And this large sociologically infused group of children definitely had an impact upon our understanding of Christian education and even age level ministry as we know it today. Now that's the large historical overview, but I did want to take just a couple of minutes also to provide a very brief, more proximate understanding of how children's pastors have come into being. And you might think of this less in this broad historical framework of the waves of Christian education in age-level ministry, and think about this through the life of a local congregation and how children's pastors tend to emerge within the life of that congregation. These are transitions in ministry, and they are not neat. I've seen churches kind of reverse themselves in these kinds of transitions, but I think it's helpful to understand why different churches may have different people working in children's ministry but use different nomenclature, have different levels of expectation, and often, many times, have different working assumptions of what's happening in the life of their children's ministry as a result of. To begin to think about it, obviously one of the things that happens in light of this birth of millennials, it's a good way to think about it in the last 20 years, is what happens when congregations begin to notice a gap, a need, if you will, in the rise of an influx of a group of people, albeit here children, and within the life of the congregation, and the need to fulfill roles in ministering to those children. And often congregations, in the midst of that pressing need, will look for warm bodies first. Now, I say that somewhat jokingly, and you can't see the tongue in cheek, but to be frank with you, many times, and many of you know as children's pastors, you recognize this, many times we just have, with the growing need, when we have an influx of children in our congregation, that the press of those children create the need for more people to do ministry with them, and we look for people who are at least willing to work with children. Sometimes we will ask for volunteers, sometimes we will draft parents, but nevertheless, they are warm bodies that we just need to help fulfill the role of doing ministry with those children, regardless of their abilities. And many times, within congregations, children's pastors occur because of just need, and someone willing to step in and fill the role to provide that warm body. But beyond that, and I don't mean to demean that, because often these were people who were at least dedicated enough to want to work with children, the most that they brought with them were parallel experiences that empowered them to serve as children's ministers, children's directors, children's workers in their own right. And those parallel experiences could be associated with almost any other form of associate ministry. So, for instance, if you need someone to lead the choir, hopefully they can sing. That's a parallel experience. Maybe, hopefully, they can even sing on tune as they lead the choir. If you need someone to work with youth, hopefully they are young at heart. And that means at least they can relate with youth. That would be a parallel experience. Not surprisingly, many young people are drafted as youth workers and many times hired as much out of their youthfulness as any other experience that they bring. So that is seen as a parallel experience to working with youth. Well, you got to think like a youth. What's fascinating is with children's ministry, often what we brought is parental skills. So it's not surprising that many times children's ministers were originally hired who were parents of children, or at least had some experience working alongside children and being present within children's lives as a part of why they would want to do that at this point. And that's the sort of first phase of the congregation would reach out to find as bringing people into leadership within ministry with children, much like they would any other associate ministry. Later, though, they began to look for professional experiences, often from parallel tracks that might also empower those children's workers. And so you might look at someone who not only was a parent, but might have had some experience, say, in educating children. So you might look at a professional, say, elementary school educator and hire them as a staff member working with children in the local congregation. Or someone who had done social work with children and hire them to oversee the life of the congregation. Or someone who had professional experience in early child care and maybe worked at a child care center for a period of time and hire them to oversee, say, nursery education. At this point, you're looking for professional experience to accompany the parallel life experience, but it's still within a parallel world. And that often churches would hire people who had some kind of background, albeit somewhere else. In one congregation I know, the children's pastor that was hired was because they'd worked in a YMCA and they'd worked with children in that YMCA. And it was good parallel experience, but they also tended to bring that experience in a way of defining what children's ministry looked like. If you hire somebody out of an elementary school, expect a schooling approach, primarily to children's ministry. If you hire somebody out of a social work background, expect primarily an emphasis on the social needs of children to influence the way we understand children's ministry. That is always the challenge of a parallel professional experience, but nevertheless, congregations often, out of the pressing need, will look for someone who has some experience and then will augment that. That's the next primary move, by the way, is what I call the augmentation of academic training, and in some ways bringing those shifts. In some sense, that might mean bringing theological education to professional backgrounds. So your children's pastor might need to have more of a kind of theological preparation, but sometimes it's the specialization. As a matter of fact, one group I have not mentioned that we find a remarkable sort of transition is many times we discover pastors who no longer want to serve as lead pastor or senior pastor, but want to bring their pastoral skills to an age level. And in doing so, what they have to do is learn a little bit more about the developmental needs of that age level. And so it's not surprising, for instance, to see even an ordained lead pastor enter in the children's ministry, but then put a lot of emphasis on specialized training on working with children and understanding where children are as a part of their journey. But for the most part, it tends to work the other way around, where we bring people into children's ministry from outside professions, and then we augment that through formal education or continuing education in Bible and theology that becomes part of the overall training of that person. But whether it is training in the specialization itself or training in the general theological understanding, both of those go hand in hand as we begin to augment and become a more informed cohort of ministers working with children or any other associate ministry. Again, recognize these transitions are not neat, but this is a kind of unfoldingness of how any kind of associate ministry track manifests itself in the life of the congregation. At some point, there is another shift, and this is more back to this broader understanding of the pastoral shift, where now we are preparing no longer directors of children's ministry, no longer staff working in children's ministry, but we are now preparing pastors to oversee ministry with children, and many times the families as well. And as a result of that, a much more exacting criteria comes into play because now we're engaged in preparation for ordination to be a pastor in the midst of children. And this does ramp up both the need for ongoing specialization, also the heavy need for a strong theological background, but finally also the need for formation into a pastoral identity. And so specializations are still important, thinking as a pastor within it, but there is more of a sense of becoming a growing pastoral generalist in the midst of that specialization. And what does it mean to be shaped as a pastor working in and among children and families, as opposed to being a children's director over the programming of children? is a really radical, different way of thinking as this field changes and grows within the life of a local congregation as well as within the life of the church at large. In so some ways, it is a kind of back to the future movement where the church already has pastors, but in the midst of the gap of an area that they do not have pastoral leadership over, they begin to reach into the lives of laity, first to find commitment, later to identify parallel experience, later to augment through professional experience and professional experience, then to emphasize academic training, and finally to seek ordination in creating pastors in the midst of that gap area, that have the same identity, commensurate identity, as lead pastors do within the life of that congregation. And there is a kind of ongoing evolving that occurs, frankly, with almost every level of associate ministry and every domain of associate ministry that I've seen, including children's ministry. So where does that leave us today? Well, in one sense, we do have to recognize that children's ministry is in a state of flux, particularly, and I'm just going to name it, within evangelicalism in the Church of the Nazarene. In some ways, we're not that far removed from even the old REA experience, where the economic downturn, particularly around 2007, 2008, had a dramatic influence upon the life of the church that now, just a few years later, we're still recovering from. And so the renaissance of children's ministry that occurred in the 1990s through the mid first century of the 21st century, spurred by millennials, hit a kind of abrupt roadblock because of the economic downturn. And if I were giving this lecture in the 1990s, I would have been able to say that children's ministry has a rosy future that is constantly growing and expanding and becoming great and important. But 2008 seemed to subvert that view in the United States, at least. While now we are just now beginning to see a reorganization of children's ministry that may once again reassert itself in the life of congregations. But the rapid uptake of professional children's pastors, while there is a growing need, we're seeing far more part-time roles than we're seeing full-time roles. And this is part of the flux of what's going on in children's ministry. And yet nowadays we are seeing churches who acknowledge the need for a children's pastor, a pastoral emphasis. But I have to stress that we still have other churches that really see children's ministers more in support roles to the lead pastor. And we actually have congregations who really still utilize the language of children's director or children's associate as a part of their history, and that puts incredible pressure on a children's pastor to understand who they are in the midst of the life of that congregation. I actually know some churches where children's pastors are really seen primarily as glorified children's directors, and they're not really recognized by the lead pastor as a pastor or a minister in their own right, even if they're ordained, because that lead pastor grew up in an era where children's workers were glorified lay people, and a children's staff member was really a children's director. And yet the church right next door may have a children's pastor who's seen as part of the core pastoral team within the life of that congregation. And this competing sort of language of director, associate, and pastor is just part and parcel of the struggle within children's ministry today. We're also seeing shifting levels of preparation and nomenclature that goes along with it. And more the professionalization of children's ministry will continue to be sort of expected, particularly as children's workers and children's directors seek ordination. And understand that ordination is not merely the validation of what they are currently doing, sometimes based on parallel professional experience, but really dependent on taking a brand new role, an identity, a formative identity of being a pastor in the midst of that congregation. And so one way to think about it is that age-level ministries may still dominate associate ministry as we understand it, but the pastor is the one that stands in the background of what those age-level ministries will probably look like as we go forward. Over time, we're going to see less a discussion of youth workers, youth directors, even youth associate. And we're going to see the language of youth pastor, but infused with a particular meaning. And this may be one of the most important shifts as we move forward in the life of the congregation. We will see pastors trying to see what it means to be faithful in ministry practice, not merely replicating, say, schooling paradigms outside the church, but asking what it means to be a congregation involved in shaping and forming youth and children. We'll see pastors asking questions about not only how is it that they are shepherds over a given subgroup of associate ministry based on an age level, so being a pastor of youth or a pastor of children, but asking what it means to pastor a congregation and serve as an advocate for children in the midst of the life of that congregation. And what does it mean to pastor youth, but be an advocate for those youth and their families in the midst of that congregation? Now, to be honest, we're not there yet. Not within evangelicalism as a whole, nor within the Church of Nazarene as a whole. But as we contemplate where we've come, in a little over 100 years, it's pretty amazing, and how we've moved from being basically a cohort of people interested in doing Christian education in general within the life of congregations to becoming specialists within that field, drawing upon both social sciences and theology to create what we know as ministry today, to becoming pastors and embodying that kind of pastoral vocation as a core identity of our role within the life of the congregation. As we go forward in this class, I really want to acknowledge that those other images have not gone away, those other historical periods. And as you look at people around you, even in the midst of your ministry, but also looking at churches that you partner with, and as you talk to people at conferences like Ignite or the Children's Pastors Conference, that you'll have to understand that different people walk into the role of children's ministry with a radically different self-definition based on their peculiar heritage and based upon the journey their congregations have taken in calling people into this ministry. Hopefully, it will help you understand the robustness as well as the messiness of children's ministry today. But it is a part of the journey that we have to contend with as we envision who we are, each of us individually and collectively, as a group of ministers working with and to and on behalf of children in the lives of local congregations. Well, thanks for putting up with this long lecture, and we'll see you later as we continue this conversation, these preliminary conversations on children's ministry, as we contemplate our role and our place. Blessings to you.